When you're trying to treat the virus of dis-ease in your operating system, you're not going to find the cure in labels that assume we are all just varying degrees of brokenness. Broadcasting live from the command center of emotional intelligence. I am the General. This is the Human OS. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we changed the name. As an expert in workplace engagement and in temperament, it is no secret that I am not an expert in marketing and branding. We met behind the scenes, decided there was a better path to take that made more sense, and I agree that this is a great path. The Human OS. That is, of course, the human operating system. I want to remind you, I stand firm on this, convicted as ever, that this is the most important broadcast that you will ever hear. On this broadcast, you're getting cutting-edge emotional intelligence technology. You're not going to find this anywhere else. Today, I'm going to demonstrate that. It's an important episode. The first two episodes of the WIDP broadcast, they highlighted some of the history of this approach of temperament, the needs-based lens versus the deficit lens that you will find in modern psychology today, that you will find on social media and from influencers that are in that space. They're in that space and they're talking about what they know because it is my belief, and I believe that the data supports this, again, we'll talk about that today, that they just don't know any better. That what they are talking about on social media and on these influencing pages, even in the courses that they create and the one-on-ones that help that they give, they're operating with the best that they know and the best that they've been exposed to. Psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, counselors. Now, I know a few. I have brushed shoulders, studied with, and of course, researched regarding what they have, even in the military. The chaplains that are in the military, I've been exposed to a lot of what they have at their disposal. They don't have this. I remember talking locally with a gentleman that was a PhD candidate and was working on his dissertation. And we were talking about psychology things because we geek out over this stuff. I know I do. So I get so excited on these broadcasts. And I asked him if he'd ever heard the word temperament before. Now, he's headed for his PhD in psychology. So this is a guy who's in the space. This is a guy who's already been in higher education at several levels in the psychology field. And he had never heard the word temperament. He said no. So higher education doesn't have it. You won't find this anywhere. I was fortunate enough, blessed enough, in fact, to be exposed to this very early. And I'm excited to share it with you now. In those two episodes, we talked about the needs-based lens and we differentiated too the difference between personality, character, and temperament inside this emotional makeup that you have, this structure of your genetic coding, designed from birth. And as a reminder, modern psychology does not take that view. They do not take the view that there is an intentional design of you uniquely structured from day one that you then take with you into life. They come from the approach that environmental impacts shape who you are. And we established in the last couple episodes, or it's certainly in the last episode, that is true, but only to a certain degree. That's true in your personality, that your personality will change, and that's true in your character, that you may even adopt a new belief system or value system based upon your environment, your upbringing, and so forth. Yes, that will affect you to some degree, but they don't mention temperament. And that's the missing piece of it all. That's the foundation of your emotional makeup. So it's important to establish that if that's at the bottom, if that supports everything above it, that we can't stop at personality and observation. We can't stop at just character traits. And so to answer, well, then why are we having all of these problems? The best that psychology has to offer today is the labels. The labels like ADHD, attention deficit. When you're in relationships, you may get into the attachment styles, how the mind is just, inattentive. And there's these degrees of dysfunction. I can test that those labels are not only inaccurate because they can't be proven, but that they're actually damaging at their core. Today's episode, it's going to be a shot across the bow at modern psychology. As the general, it's my job here on this broadcast to help you navigate this invisible emotional space. And as the general, as I'm helping you steer your ship, you're the captain of your ship, and I'm steering you in a specific direction called the needs-based lens to help guide you through life on a day-to-day basis. Modern psychology is trying to answer the question of why we do what we do. That is psychology. It's understanding human behavior. Well, on this broadcast, we're going to simplify human behavior because there's an assumption that human behavior is so complex that it's impossible to understand, and that's just simply not true. Human behavior has a core, and those core motivations and core decisions are rooted in temperament. So today is the shot across the bow of modern psychology. It's a tall order. It's a bit of an audacious order, but that's what we're going to do here. As I said, this broadcast is not for the deaf and dumb. And it's also not for everybody. It is not for everybody. Not everybody wants to be this emotionally transparent or this internally aware. They don't want to. I'll tell you later why that is, and I'll back it up with evidence. I'm excited about today's broadcast. I'll say now that if you hear some paper shuffling, I've got a lot of notes and a lot of quotes. So, Kyle, help me out on this one and maybe get rid of some of the paper shuffles if you can, but I don't think that even he is good enough to get rid of all of them. I think there's going to be just some natural shuffling of notes. So while I'm on that, let's just start off with a big fat thank you to Kyle. So Kyle Goodnight is in charge of Goodnight Podcasting Solutions. He is the one responsible for the editing of this podcast and making it palatable for the listeners. Kyle, thank you. I appreciate you. I had a slice of turkey and had your name on it of thankfulness. So thank you, Kyle. So that's Kyle Goodnight. You can find him at kylegoodnight.com. That's GOODKNIGHT. He handles podcast strategy. He'll help you with your marketing and how to get the word out. Even help you with the graphics of your podcast cover and those things. He's got it all. So he is a one-stop shop for podcasting. But most importantly, he does the editing. God bless you for that. Hashtag bless, Kyle. Thank you. Okay, this is a fun episode. I have to admit, I had a blast putting all this together. I had a blast doing the homework. Not many of you listening are experts in human behavior. You have your own area of expertise. You've done the research in that area. It makes sense. Thank you. God bless you for what you do, especially if you're in the healthcare field. We love you. We appreciate you. Kyle is also a first responder. Kyle, thank you. I was military. There's a very, it's a bit of a distant bond, but a bond nonetheless of those of us that had a little bit of a calling towards the greater good in mind. And the healthcare profession is certainly that. I heard recently that a couple of changes were being made in the healthcare profession that weren't calling certain degrees professional degrees, and I think that's a step in the wrong direction. But that's not what we're going to be talking about here today. We trust modern psychology. We trust psychiatrists. We trust therapists, and there are absolutely ways and treatments that those professions help others. Today on this broadcast, I'm only calling out a dynamic that I myself felt first. I felt this first. Didn't have the information beforehand many, many years ago. I felt it. It just didn't feel right. And what I felt internally was that the labels that were being tossed around that I was hearing from different sources, they just didn't resonate with me. Not because I did not have them, they didn't resonate just for the way that human beings work. In 1968, the APA, which is in psychology, that's the American Psychiatric Association, they publish what's called the DSM. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is just the classification of mental disorders that are referenced within that publication. They have a certain type and so on, and so this is their list. Black's Law Dictionary governs law. This governs the field of psychiatry. So when you're dealing with mental disorders and you're diagnosing, this is where you're pulling it from. So the American Psychiatric Association in 1968, they published what reflected a widely held belief among the mental health professionals that psychiatric conditions, mental conditions, could be clearly distinguished in the same way that you can distinguish physical illnesses in medicine. From 1968 to 1972, there was a man by the name of Mr. David Rosenhan. I may stumble over his name. For whatever reason, I keep on calling him Rosenthal, and that is not right. David Rosenhan. Now, he was a professor at Stanford. He was a professor of law and psychology. So he operated in that space and kept up to date with the latest goings on. Conclusions that the APA was drawing and the reflection that the invisible side of things can be clearly diagnosed just like the physical side of things, he had some pushback to that. Now, if you remember, we established in the last episode how difficult it is to really pinpoint things in this invisible space. So difficult, in fact, that you cannot have in psychology the theories of human behavior will always be theory. Maslow's hierarchy of need is theory because you cannot nail down invisible things like that in that mental emotional space. So it's always theory. So keep that in mind. It's always objectively theory. Okay. That was Professor Rosenhan's problem with that reflection. If you can nail down in the same way that you can nail down a physical illness with a diagnosis and, of course, treatment, they were saying that you could do the same thing with mental disorders. That's potent. Dr. Rosenhan disagreed. So he conducted a study, and it was a fascinating study. What he did, I'm going to give brief summaries. Now, I've got pages and pages of quotes and notes. I'm pulling this information from 2 articles. I'll reference those articles in the show notes, okay? This particular article was written on Psychology Today. Actually, they both were, the 2 that I'm going to be referencing, written in Psychology Today. Now, this was published in 2025. The study was done in 1970, 68 to 72, published in 73. And Dr. Rosenhan had his own publication for that. I'm referencing an article that refers to that publication and kind of summarizes that. So that's what I want to be talking about. I want to talk about this study that happened 50 years ago. What Dr. Rosenhan did to challenge this assumption by the APA and for the betterment of the field, he decided to gather together some patients that had no symptoms and that were not mentally unstable. They were essentially normal people. And he decided that he was going to, him included, by the way, he was one of them, they were going to attempt admission into psychiatric hospital. They used 8 different hospitals across 5 states, and 8 of them, Dr. Rosenhan was one of them. So he was essentially attempting admission himself. All they did was they did change their name. They did not disclose, or they falsified, which in this case was, understandable, that, their profession and where they worked. And what they did in the intake process was they simply said that they were hearing a voice, and that voice contained the word empty, hollow, and thud. Once they were admitted, they stopped stimulating psychiatric symptoms. In other words, that's all they said. And once they got in, they didn't have any more. They didn't keep the farce going, if you will, other than, respond to the fake name that they had. They stopped simulating all symptoms. This is as simple as it gets. They got in, that's it. They just interacted as if in everyday life, whenever doctors, nurses, whoever was seeing them would talk to them, they were normal, basically. They were acting normal, they were being normal, and they would even ask them, do you have any symptoms? And they would say, no, I'm feeling good. So you can read all this in the article. I'm very much paraphrasing, and I'm going to hit a few quotes. Now, they were called pseudo patients. That was mean they were patients, but they weren't actual people with mental disorders. And they were trying to find out this important fact. Now, I'm going to quote this from the article. Dr. Rosenhan said that, quote, if these pseudo patients were consistently recognized as mentally healthy, then it would support the idea that psychiatrists could reliably distinguish between normal and abnormal states. Now, to put that in layman's terms, so in other words, that psychiatrically normal is distinct, and that it can be identified, psychiatrically normal can be identified by competent professionals. There's a normal, there's an abnormal. And to be distinguishing between those two is what's at stake. Can competent professionals do that? Now, this is a psychiatric hospital. These are the ones who are getting treatment for the mental disorders that they have. So those 8 participants went through 8 hospitals, and actually several of them went through more, for a total of 12 total hospitals. 12 hospitals that they gained admission to by just using those 3 words and stating that they heard voices in those 3 words. That's it. Then they gave up they didn't simulate anything else after that. Now, the average stay was 19 days. Some of them stayed 7 days, and some of them stayed as much as 52 days during this study. What happened was, during all of their stays, let's talk about the admission first. In the admission, out of the 12 stays, 11 times they were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then they were staying at the hospital and granted admission for the treatment of schizophrenia. When they were discharged, 11 out of 12 diagnosed with schizophrenia, 11 out of 12 times they were discharged with schizophrenia in remission. All right. 1 out of 12 was admitted with manic depressive psychosis. 3 words, hearing voices. These were the diagnoses. Okay, now remember, they are diagnosing people who are not actually mentally unstable or that actually contain a mental disorder. Therefore, competent professionals in a psychiatric hospital, it is their job then to treat this, which means they were treating nothing, but that process, let's hope that it would uncover and walk them through finding out that they were in fact healthy. That didn't happen. In any single case, they did not discover a threshold of health, a distinct point of health at any time between all 12 occurrences of these 8 patients. Pseudo patients, excuse me. These 8 pseudo patients. That includes Dr. Rosenhan. So let me look through my notes and see if there's anything else. Nope, that looks good. That looks good. That looks good. Nope, that's at the heart of it. Okay, here's what Dr. Rosenhan said. Now, this is just to kind of wrap up the beginning here. He said, and I quote, "At its heart, the question of whether the sane can be distinguished from the insane and whether degrees of insanity can be distinguished from each other is a simple matter. Do the salient characteristics that lead to diagnosis reside in the patients themselves or in the environments and contexts in which observers find them?" When the patients were released, knowing that none of them were actually containing a mental disorder, the question has to be asked from his findings: why was there a wrong diagnosis during admission? And how did the admission process not sift and sort the psychiatrically healthy from the unhealthy? Remember, the shortest stay at the hospital was a week. And they were still discharged with schizophrenia in remission. So here's what Professor Rosenhan said. Again, this is in the article. Quote, "The reasons for this bias are not hard to find of why this admission problem happened, of why this wrong diagnosis happened in every single instance. They're not hard to find. It is clearly less dangerous to misdiagnose illness than to misdiagnose health. Better to err on the side of caution to suspect illness, even among the healthy." Now, to Professor Rosenhan, that was actually not the most dangerous part. That finding is disturbing enough, and we can talk all day about, the implications of that. What he found most disturbing was that, considering that the patients dropped all pretense of a psychiatric disturbance after they got admitted, they could not escape that diagnosis. So it was presumed that a competent practitioner, they were that even being well acquainted then with the patient through the process, they would eventually identify the diagnosis that it was erroneous. They would correct it, but in every single case, there was no correction of the diagnosis. Now, that was what was the most disturbing to him. Here's what he said about this. He said the diagnosis seems so powerful that many participants' normal behaviors were overlooked entirely, or they were profoundly misinterpreted. So, for example, and he notes this in his article, he says, if they were doing normal behaviors such as pacing around or that they were writing frequently, they attributed that to their diagnoses. They attributed that behavior was part of what they were suffering from. It was not implied and not assumed that they might have been pacing because they were bored. I like to pace when I think. I'm just thinking. So that wasn't an assumption. or that they were frequently writing just because that's what writers do. They might get up and think for a minute, sit back down, start writing again. None of them were just assumed to, maybe they're just writing something. Nope. It was all part of the observations of their behavior attributed to their schizophrenia. Well, he's frequently writing. They could not escape their diagnosis. So that means that rather than any normal behavior be perceived, all it did was reinforce the diagnosis. There was no opportunity to challenge it from the health professionals or from the patients themselves, the pseudo-patients. Professor Rosenhan goes on to say this: the behaviors points more to the, and now I quote, enormous overlap in behaviors of the sane and the insane than to the competence of psychiatrists, psychologists, or nurses. That there's an overlap of behaviors. He goes on, he says, how many patients might be sane outside the psychiatric hospital but seem insane in it? Not because craziness resides in them, as it were, but because they are responding to a bizarre setting. It gets better, folks. The plot thickens. That's not the end of this particular story. It gets even better. There was a second study done by Dr. Rosenhan. This one cracks me up. This one was funny. It's tragically funny. There was a second study done where he reached out after the findings had already been publicized. In other words, there was already the chatter amongst the healthcare professionals in that field of the study that was done at those psychiatric hospitals and how they were errant in their diagnoses. Dr. Rosenhan reached out to another hospital, and he said within the next 3 months, we're going to be sending one or more patients, pseudo-patients, to gain admittance into your facility. So now the staff, knowing the findings from the last study, they now know. And in those 3 months, the staff and the psychiatrists, nurses, the whole staff of that hospital had 193 patients that tried to gain admittance into the hospital. So their job over those 3 months were to basically monitor the intake process and document, what was the diagnosis, what did they come in for, and so on, of these 193 patients. Of those 193 patients, they had a 10-point scale from most likely to least likely to be a pseudo-patient. So they were doing their admission, but they were also doing kind of an analysis on how likely they are to be a pseudo-patient within those 3-month period. And out of those 193 people, 41 were judged as highly likely by at least one staff member, highly likely to be a pseudo-patient, that they may not actually, they just be faking it, or they don't have any symptoms. They're actually a normal person. They're just trying to gain admittance in, that they're a pseudo-patient. 41 judged as highly likely out of 193 by at least one staff member, 23 of them by at least one psychiatrist, and 19 by both one staff member and one psychiatrist out of 193. Here's the best part. Dr. Rosenhan never sent any people to be pseudo-patients. Here's what he said. Again, this is in that article, but here's what he said. Here's what I said. I keep saying doctor, it's professor. He's not doctor, he's professor. Professor Rosenhan, here's what he said in his publication. He said, it is clear we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. The hospital itself imposes a special environment in which meanings of behavior can be easily misunderstood. End quote. Well, not end quote. There's more. The findings point to, this is Professor Rosenhan now. The findings point to an unacceptable preponderance and persistence of type 2 errors, those are mental disorders categorized, by competent psychiatric staff, and to the danger of psychiatric harm to patients posed by then current psychiatric practices. He basically said the system's broken, and even the competent professionals, they don't have the ability to distinguish the sane from the insane definitively. When they weren't expecting anybody, they got all the diagnoses wrong. When they were expecting people and their reputation and their credentials were on the line, they oversuspected. And so really, no one really knows whether those patients were actually had a mental disorder or not. They were all legitimate in that they were honest patients that were getting admittance into the hospital. But no one knows, including the psychiatrists, which were which, because they couldn't tell definitively. That's pretty not great. Now, that was in 1973. That was in 1973 that he published those findings. That's 50 years ago. 50 years ago. That article that I'm referring to, again, it's in the show notes if you want to read that article. It's pretty interesting, and Dr. Professor Rosenhan had his publication as well. If you want to dive into that, I geek out over this stuff. You may not, but that's a good brief summary of what happened. I found that very interesting. A lot of people don't know that study ever happened. So in 2025, June 2025, Psychology Today published this particular article that's referencing this 1973 study. Well, a couple of years before that, which we're going to call both of these just modern Psychology Today, modern articles, in 2022, they published an article also, and here was the title of the article: The Real Reason Everyone Seems to Have ADHD These Days. Now, in 50 years, I'm going to talk about this article. You would think that the conclusions that Dr. Rosenhan highlighted in his findings about how we can't definitively tell, even the most competent professionals cannot definitively tell, which was a very strong argument to the top dogs saying that we could, just the same as we could a physical illness. The fact that we can't tell, now we have 50 years in between for improvement. We have 50 years of, does this raise any alarms, and maybe we should look into this. There was one decade between now, I don't remember when, I think it was the 90s. The 90s that were declared the age of the brain, where it was all about diving into how the mind works. And a lot of books came out, a lot of public, I've read lots of books on just how the brain works and what it does, and there's a lot of stuff out there. We've grown. Then we had the internet. Now anybody can find anything that they want to. So there's this information everywhere that everybody has access to now, that you can get smart in any area. Even without going to school, you can at least learn things. And self-diagnosis has picked up speed. To try and assess yourself physically is hard enough. To try and assess yourself mentally and emotionally, well, you're going to need some information. And so a lot of the social media influencers of today that get on to talk about some of these things, ADHD being just one of them. But am I the only one that when topics like that get talked about, that it just feels like something's missing, like it's just not quite right? It's almost a fortune cookie diagnosis. Now, again, I am not a mental health care professional. We just established that even the best ones get it wrong over some pretty serious stuff. This broadcast is about the human operating system. We're just establishing a principle that there's information out there. And as a human being, I'm wondering, what is the most reliable? What is the most relevant? Because I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate daily life. Does that resonate with you? Maybe. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with human behavior. And not just me. I've got to figure out my spouse. I've got to figure out my kids. I've got to work back through my childhood and see if there's anything wrong there. I'm trying to figure out what's going on so that I can function in a healthy way moving forward. I picked this article for a reason, because it's going to show you, and I'll just spoiler alert here, it's going to show you that really no progress was made. Matter of fact, we've almost digressed. Before I get into that article, I will shout out to Connie. Connie Davis is the reason that this broadcast exists. She is the reason that this came to fruition, and she said that she would sponsor me for 6 months, one broadcast a month, and I know how long a month is in between these broadcasts. She would sponsor one broadcast a month because she doesn't just believe that humans deserve better. She lives out temperament. She lives out the truths that have happened in her own life, of the revelations that have happened in her own life, even so much so that Maiden Explorations was established, which is her company that she's running with her daughter, as a matter of fact. And their resources and their initiatives are about how commerce is more than just trading money. How commerce is really humans interacting at an emotional level. And the decisions and movements we make in every area of life are commerce. So how we are practicing our commerce, that's what she covers. And she has a banking background, so that makes a lot of sense. She was in financial institutions and she worked at some technical levels there. So she's bringing that experience in with what she witnessed every single day and a lot of brokenness in the systems. And they're the same root causes. It's because understanding human behavior seems complex. And banks are not responsible for human behavior. So it makes sense that there might be a gap. Well, it turns out there's gaps in the psychology profession too. There's gaps at psychiatric hospitals in 1973, as we just established. Thank you, Connie, for sponsoring this broadcast. She is at ConnieDavisSpeaks.com. If you want to dive in more and reach out to her, if something interests you, she can point the way, whether it be about this broadcast or about some of her other broadcasts that she's sponsoring, as well as her own work. So reach out to Connie. Thank you again. Once again, another piece of turkey for you this Thanksgiving season. Thank you, Connie, for sponsoring this. So in August 2022, Psychology Today published an article written by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ralph Lewis, MD. Dr. Lewis operates a youth psychiatry clinic. And again, the title of the article, The Real Reason Everyone Seems to Have ADHD These Days. He establishes in 2022, and I quote, most textbooks or official websites state that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, portraying it as an abnormal brain condition with specific causes, end quote. In his article, he's establishing a few things, first of which, what is even ADHD? And so the textbooks say that it's one thing. Here's what the CDC says that's going to back this up as well. This is also in his article, but I'm going to quote it here. It's important for the context of our conversation. ADHD, the CDC, Center for Disease Control. ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders of childhood. Scientists are studying causes and risk factors in an effort to find a better way to manage and reduce the chances of a person having ADHD. The causes and risk factors are unknown, but current research shows that genetics play an important role. I think we've got as much information also as on the common cold. We basically know nothing. So the CDC says, here it is, everybody has it, or everybody either does have or does not have, and basically genetics play an important role in that. That's the CDC's conclusion for ADHD. So Dr. Lewis is noting in here that ADHD is being looked at in a completely wrong light. Now, this broadcast is not talking about ADHD, and his point was not just about ADHD. His point is the principle of the thing. So let me open up a term here that this may be the first time you've heard this term. This is called executive function, okay? So a person's normal behavior, he refers to that as executive function. Now, executive function is a way of talking about the cognitive processes that a person has to plan and execute your goals. Okay. In those processes, that can have the amount of attention control that you have, the amount of working memory that you have, kind of the random access memory that you have, and your problem solving. Because again, we're planning and we're executing. Okay, so your executive function is basically a bell curve of how well or efficiently that you do these things to help plan and execute your goals. That's the executive function. And that bell curve of the, this back and forth bell curve of where everybody, because everybody has the executive function, everybody is required to function to have these skills to plan and execute goals for your life, for yourself, just in your daily living. So this is just the daily mode. This is normal as a human being. Here's what Dr. Lewis says. Each of us falls somewhere along, this is a quote from his article, each of us falls somewhere along that bell curve of executive function, having varying degrees of executive function, just as with most human traits. Varying degrees. It makes us human, but we have these in varying degrees. So this is normal. People meeting criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD are in most cases simply those whose executive function is further toward the left end of that bell curve. In other words, ADHD is actually just a degree of normal, according to Dr. Lewis, MD. So is there nowhere that gives us a specific characteristic list of traits that can offer a yes-no for ADHD? In Professor Rosenhan's experience, insanity and sanity did not have a definitive yes or no clarity and threshold. And in 50 years of progress, we've got things like ADHD that don't have a definitive yes or no. As a matter of fact, it's a diagnosis that actually could be defined as a degree of normal. Anybody else confused? That's 50 years of work. That's the best that psychology has. And Dr. Lewis, MD, is calling it out. Here's what he says. Despite the language of the textbooks and official websites implying that ADHD is a clearly defined, well-demarcated disorder, most experts, if pressed, would no doubt agree that ADHD is almost always a continuum of normality. There is a lack of discontinuity, a lack of a clear threshold between those who have and do not have ADHD. He goes on, I'm going to keep quoting here because it's extremely relevant to where we're going with this. Quote, the diagnosis is an inexact process based on clinical impression, not something determined by objective testing and measurement. It is also unavoidably influenced by the sociocultural context in which the individual is expected to function. Professor Rosenhan said the exact same thing, that the environment and the pretense of the environment, the diagnosis that stuck to the pseudo-patient, created the lens through which then they were viewed. Now we have people self-diagnosing ADHD as an example because they see a list of characteristics, and like a fortune cookie, pretty much everybody can match that to some degree because it contains a list that actually is executive function skills that are normal as a human being to daily living of planning and executing your goals. I like in his article what he said. He put it real simply. This is Dr. Lewis again. He said, imagine if we had a world of tall people. It's tall people world. And the constructed world of tall people catered to tall people, where things were out of reach, and then short people become relatively disadvantaged in tall people world. So since the short people have a difficult time navigating tall people world, they could be considered as having a, quote, height deficit disorder. I used to say it more abruptly. If I'm ever feeling fat, just go stand next to a fat person and you'll always feel skinny. He says, in tall people world, all the short people could be labeled. He makes a great point in his article. Those 2 articles are in your show notes if y'all want to read more about that. Here's the point. In 50 years, that's the best psychology has. In 50 years, they cannot tell the difference between sane and insane. And ADHD has no actual definitive characteristics. It's just a degree of normal. In another article, just kind of like Dr. Lewis's, they mentioned something that I thought was important to kind of mention here. Self-diagnosis is being on the rise. There's more behind it than just, hey, I kind of feel broken and I want to see what it is so I can fix it. That's not what's going on necessarily. I can't function right. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Kind of read into it, see a sickness on TV and you go, oh no, I have those symptoms. Maybe I have that. The rise in the self-diagnoses, other than being actual higher illness rates. In this other article, he simply said this. He said it's actually driven by other motivations like identity seeking, validation needs, simplicity of explanation. In other words, how easy it is to understand what ADHD and just go by that. Does that make sense? And there was even a pull in because it helped you feel like you belonged. Like there was a group I can identify with. I can feel that. The military's that way. I know what that group belonging does, and it's actually kind of a cool thing. Well, in self-diagnosis, ADHD can be this group belonging. And you have this belonging of brokenness. Today, our shot across the bow to call out some of these things that have been documented even over the past 50 years of where we stand in modern psychology and the best that we have. I want to diagnose modern psychology. And my diagnosis is that the deficit lens is the disease. I propose on this broadcast that the deficit lens could be the source of your dis-ease. Is there no such thing as ADHD? That's not what I'm saying. Is there no such thing as clinically insane? That's not what I'm saying. And there are treatments that help. But research also shows that help is not even that impressive in terms of results. I think the deficit lens is the source of dis-ease internally. Luckily, the human operating system, like a program, is programmable. The mind and the way the mind works, it can be rewritten. It can be overwritten. And these beliefs that we have that we're seeing the lens, seeing ourselves through a deficit lens can be restructured. That the virus of the deficit lens causing the dis-ease, that it can be patched. When you're trying to treat the virus of dis-ease in your operating system, you're not going to find the cure in labels that assume we are all just varying degrees of brokenness. In today's episode, there hasn't been a lot of humor today. I tried to laugh a little bit, but it really hasn't been a lot of humor. I apologize. This is a serious one, but I'm having a lot of fun doing it. I hope this has been kind of enlightening for you. I want you to say, because remember, on this broadcast, we don't just say it, we feel it. But I know that in order to get to your heart, I've got to make it through the gauntlet of the mind. That this awareness is the sharpest blade that I have to navigate the gauntlet of the mind. And I know a lot of you are data gatherers. I know that you love information, and I know that you love good information. This is good information. This is stuff that maybe you weren't aware of. Because again, you're not an expert in human behavior. Understandable. I'm glad I can bring it to you. The needs-based lens that we're talking about here in the human OS, the needs-based lens of understanding your emotional operating system, as I said at the very beginning of this episode, is cutting edge emotional intelligence technology. That article was from 2022 that talked about ADHD. The article the publication from 1973 that documented Professor Rosenhan's findings was, by the way, saw fit to note by publishing again in 2025 an article that talked about it. And Psychology Today's editor-in-chief has a PhD in psychology. He saw fit to pass it through, that it was relevant enough to mention and talk about. 50 years of the best psychology has. That this is what they're discussing in their top publications. This deficit-based lens is degrading to the human operating system. There could be a chance for you, if you're one of the few that listen to this broadcast, because many don't want this level of awareness. They will lose their sense of belonging in their brokenness. They will lose their victim status. They will have to be accountable for their actions and their behavior. They won't want to hear this. They don't want to know. My father used to say the only thing worse than ignorance is willful ignorance. Some don't want to know. If you've listened this far, you are elite. You are in the right space. You are one of those people who not only wants better for yourself, but you've already felt something just wasn't quite right, and you continue to look for answers, and here you are. This is cutting edge emotional intelligence technology, temperament. The needs-based approach of your human operating system is just beautiful. You know why? Because it does definitively identify what is going on at the foundation of who you are. It does definitively answer the question, who am I? Temperament does that. There's not another approach in psychology that can. Today, for this broadcast, if you're looking for the action steps to take away from what we talked about today, I've really enjoyed this. I was so looking forward to this and sharing this information with you. Again, I geek out over this stuff. I love it. I think it's great. But how important it is for you to be functionally healthy every single day and to move out of that deficit lens and into this needs-based perspective. Valid, legitimate needs, good, healthy, thriving needs that you have, to brainstorm how to get those met and get them filled. The very first step is awareness and becoming aware of that deficit lens and the beliefs and the viruses that are causing the disease, and you, as a competent, critical thinker, participant of your own life, you get to consider the perspective that you've heard today and challenge it by asking whether any of those other labels, any labels that you've heard, any social media influencers, any words that just didn't quite hit right, did they resonate with you? Did they help? Did they help answer? Did they get you closer to answering the question, who am I? Did they get you closer to understanding yourself? Or did they actually muddy the waters? Did they actually give you a label that you really kind of didn't own deep inside of yourself? If you didn't own it, good for you. If you didn't embrace it as this is just who I am, good for you. You're doing it. You're doing it. You're challenging the best out there and saying, I just feel like that's just not right. That's just not the whole truth. Today, just as you have been feeling inside, now you have some substance and some evidence to back that up. Today, that awareness, you can take forward steps for yourself. You today get to reprogram your operating system. Today, you get an upgrade. You get an upgrade of this needs-based lens, and you're already getting validated coming into this new group of belonging called I do have needs. They are legitimate. I've been right the whole time in what I've been feeling in life situations, in my relationships, in my workplace, in my decisions. When I'm stressed out and feeling it's not right for me and wanting to step away, I can. All of this is an upgrade into your thriving life of full function and health. True to you. You get to feel that relief now, and even just one step closer of being your true self and answering the question, who am I? You're identifying yourself. You're valuable, and you're absolutely worthy of this level of health. I'm the general. This is the human OS.